Well, we've got a rather fluid situation, no pun intended, unfolding in the Arabian Sea. Yesterday, according to the UAE's transportation minister, I think, there were about 4 oil tankers off the coast of the UAE, which were sabotaged somewhere off the coast of Fujairah. Now, apparently, no oil somehow magically seeped into the sea. There was some kind of a sabotage operation on these boats, but it was not enough to injure anyone or to spill any oil, at least as far as we know yet. Now, we don't know what the method of sabotage was, although I would have to guess that it was some kind of small bomb. Because the way that this is being talked about, it sounds more like they consider this to be kind of an attack and not just some kind of sabotage into where they, made it so that the boat's engines would fail or something. It's not like somebody drained all the oil out of the engine so that it'd blow up, mid-sea. Now, we also have no official word on who the UAE or the owners of the ships, which, by the way, were not from the UAE. They were from multiple countries. We have no word on who they suspect of committing these acts of sabotage. Although it wouldn't be too hard to imagine at this point, especially the way that they're all talking, that they will, after some investigation, determine that it was in fact Iran who was responsible, whether that be the Iranian military directly or some Iranian proxy group cutout. Now, I don't know, I have no way of knowing, we don't have enough information, who exactly perpetrated these acts of sabotage, or whether there were any acts of sabotage at all, because there were satellite images taken yesterday that are publicly available, and none of them show any smoke or anything bellowing up from any of these ships. So we have no evidence so far that there were even any ships damaged, and they're not even claiming that anybody died or that any oil leaked out. So then the question becomes, if Iran did this, why? What's the point? What does Iran have to gain from doing this? When Iran knows that there is a U.S. carrier strike group on the way to try and intimidate them, and potentially, a few B-52 bombers stationed in Qatar that are ready at any moment to deliver a nuclear payload to their capital, why in their right mind would they, at this very point in time, decide to do some kind of covert terrorist op against, oil tankers, which of course are a very sensitive matter? I mean, if you look at this from Iran's perspective, they really have nothing to gain by bombing or trying to sabotage these oil tankers, other than giving the U.S. an excuse to invade their country. Now, there is one reason I can think of, and it's not a very good reason, and it's extremely risky for the Iranians, but I will get back to that later. For now, who do I think is the most likely perpetrator in this case, i.e. the group of people who actually have something to gain and who would actually make sense would carry out this operation? That, of course, is probably the CIA. That's the only group I can think of that has anything to gain from doing this. And obviously, if we ask ourselves, what do they have to gain? Well, the CIA wants to take out enemies of the United States government. That's their job, is to engage in covert operations. And if they're able to pull off some kind of sabotage of 4 oil tankers in the Arabian Sea, well, then that can be used as justification for the Pentagon then to go invade Iran. And in fact, there is some reason to believe that the CIA was planning some kind of high-level covert operation related to Iran, because something that I did a video on 2 days ago, that secret meeting at the CIA headquarters, which is not so secret anymore since it was leaked to NBC, which was chaired by John Bolton and was attended by the Defense Secretary, the Secretary of State, the Director of the CIA, the Director of National Intelligence, and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. This was a meeting about Iran, but not held at the Situation Room at the White House. It was held directly at the CIA. Well, according to NBC sources, and again, I think that there's a chance that this whole story that NBC put out about this meeting in Langley, Virginia, may have been disinformation in and of itself. But leaving that aside, if we assume this is true, their sources, which were former CIA people, said explicitly that typically if there's going to be high-level meetings from folks from the cabinet, if you have cabinet officials meeting at the CIA itself, that typically are meetings about covert operations, i.e. not just spying, because the CIA spies normally and collects intelligence. They do that all day long, but the CIA also takes affirmative action. So therefore, this meeting in Langley may have been a meeting about this very operation to sabotage these 4 oil tankers. Now, it's not that unbelievable that they would go about doing this, considering that no oil spilled and no one died. So to me, this seems like a plan that would have worked out pretty well. If you think about it, if the CIA wanted to create some reason to invade Iran, but then they didn't necessarily want to kill a bunch of people in doing it, this would be a good way of going about that. Now, on the other hand, the case against this being a false flag by the CIA is that if the CIA really wanted to carry out a false flag attack, which would give the Pentagon justification for invading Iran, well, then they probably would want some people to die, because I think that this is a pretty weak justification for going to war. Now, who knows, maybe the media will pick up on it and they'll try and get some traction off of this, but so far, let's assume that Iran is 100% responsible for sabotaging 4 oil tankers in the Arabian Sea. That seems pretty minor to me. I don't know why you would invade a country over that. Now, there's also the potential that perhaps there was some kind of miscalculation, and they had bombs that were rigged to explode on these ships, but they weren't big enough to do enough damage or something like that. But that's getting way down a rabbit hole of speculation that I don't really want to spend time on. Now, if the CIA really wanted to have some kind of false flag to justify a war with Iran, a much better idea would have been, say, bombing the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad and killing a few Americans. That, I think, would have been a much better justification for invading Iran, because then you're not killing too many people. There's not a whole lot of damage done. It's just one building, and you can take out some civilians around there too, so that the death count gets higher, but then you put the faces of the Americans who died all over TV, and that would be a perfect way to get people fired up into war. Now, back to Iran. The one, I think, good motivation that Iran may have had to try and blow up these boats is specifically because it doesn't look like they have anything to gain, and therefore people may, like me, blame it on the CIA. Now, I think that's incredibly risky, because the amount of people in the world who would blame the CIA, who would even consider that the CIA would blow up these boats to try and start a war with Iran, are pretty slim. So I think that if the Iranians actually went ahead with this with that plan, they were idiots, because it's far more likely that these attacks would be blamed on them and used as a justification for war. So that's way too risky. So in other words, the whole reverse false flag kind of idea I don't think really worked. The idea that this was a false flag perpetrated by Iran to frame the CIA, to make it look like the CIA perpetrated a false flag. I guess reverse false flag isn't a good term. Perhaps double false flag, because they were false flagging a false flag. Now, one other very small possibility that I don't think has a very high likelihood of actually being true is that if you look at where these boats were were supposedly sabotaged, it was off the coast of Fujairah, which is the only UAE port that is outside of the Persian Gulf. Most oil in the world flows out of the Persian Gulf through the Straits of Hormuz and into the Arabian Sea. Well, this is a port on the other side, south of the Straits of Hormuz, outside the Persian Gulf, that's directly on the Arabian Sea. Or rather, I guess they call this area the Gulf of Oman. But still, it's past the Straits of Hormuz. So if Iran were to close the Strait of Hormuz, this port would not be affected. So therefore, you could make the case that perhaps the Iranians wanted to sabotage these boats from Fujairah to prove to the Arabs that, hey, even if we close the Strait of Hormuz and you think you can still export your oil out of Fujairah, that's not true, because we can still hit you there. Now, that to me is just getting way ahead of the game. I think that it doesn't make sense for them to try and send that kind of a message, especially considering the tension with the U.S., but even still, Iran has not closed the Strait of Hormuz yet, and frankly, I doubt if they ever will. Because if they close the Strait of Hormuz, that's not going to be a blockade that lasts very long, because the U.S. will take them out. Iran is not going to have a chance to try and sabotage boats in the port of Fujairah if they block the Strait of Hormuz. That will be the end of their country. Now, something interesting that I think might point to Iranian involvement in this case is that a Iranian-friendly Lebanese news channel put out a story early yesterday saying that there had been some ships that exploded in port in Fujairah, not off the coast. And they had reported that these were big explosions and that the tankers were on fire and that it was essentially total mayhem. Now, this, of course, did not occur, although it was picked up around the world by, Iran-friendly media in Iran itself and also in Indonesia. So there is perhaps this reminds me a bit of, if you remember on 9/11 when the BBC had that news bulletin where they said, oh, yeah, Building 7, that was demolished by the fire department earlier today because they thought the building was unsafe. And if you look in the background of the shot, you can see that Building 7 is still standing, and then, of course, later that day, Building 7 collapsed. After that, there were a lot of conspiracy theorists who came out and said, oh, see, the BBC got a warning ahead of time that they were going to demolish Building 7. This was used as sort of like proof to say that, oh, Building 7 didn't collapse on its own, it was demolished. Because how else would the BBC know ahead of time that Building 7 was going to fall, and why would they report something that just 100% didn't happen if they had zero sourcing? They thought it was much more likely that the BBC just got the timing wrong, and they had forewarning on this, and then it ended up actually happening. Well, you could say the same in this case about Mayadeen in Lebanon, that channel, because you could say that they had forewarning perhaps from Iranian sources that there were going to be some boats blowing up in the port of Fujairah, and then it turns out that the Iranian op did not work out, and that these boats ended up having smaller explosions perhaps than expected, and this happened out at sea instead of in port, or perhaps even the bombs were discovered when they were out at sea and detonated. So this may be used as some sort of indication that this was an Iranian op that just went wrong. Now, an interesting point that may indicate that the CIA was behind this is that the U.S. Department of Transportation last Thursday issued a warning essentially saying, Iran looks very likely to target civilian vessels in the next coming weeks, so we should watch out for that. This, of course, is very similar to that case, just like with Building 7 or with the Iranians predicting that there were going to be boats blowing up in the port of Fujairah. If the Department of Transportation is predicting that Iran is going to blow up boats and then some boats blow up, well, then it's very easy for them to pin that on Iran. And, of course, if, say, the CIA was plotting to blow up these boats and blame it on Iran, it would be very much in their interest to have the DOT put out this warning. So, in other words, we have a huge mess of disinformation flying in all different directions, and it's very hard to sort through all of this. So we're going to have to just use reason and logic and try and figure out what makes the most sense. Because we have no evidence either way that anyone is going to be involved, that either of these two sides, the Iran or the CIA, are involved. And we probably will never have that evidence until it's declassified 30 years from now. Who knows? This could be another USS Maine or Gulf of Tonkin that we're talking about. But in the meantime, Mike Pompeo decided to cancel his trip to Moscow and fly to Brussels instead. And he's apparently going to be meeting with European leaders to discuss Iran. We don't know exactly what about Iran, but I'll have to keep tuned into that and see what comes out of that meeting, and I'll probably be discussing that here tomorrow. So if you gained anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and subscribing. And if you do subscribe, click the bell so that you don't miss that video about Pompeo coming up, assuming that anything interesting comes out of that meeting. I think that the Iran situation is heating up now and is probably not going to slow down for at least the next week and a half or so.